Fine. Let me give you some background. First reading comes from the book of Daniel. All right. Now Daniel is really an interesting book. It's different than all the rest of the books of the Old Testament. Right. It was the last book to be written, and it was written to people who are undergoing persecution. Now there's a name for books like this. We call them apocalyptic, because when you're writing this under persecution, you have to write secretly. You can't openly talk about the government or the persecutor, or else you get in trouble, right? And so oftentimes they'll use symbolic language, or they'll use a story from a different time to help you understand what's going on in your current life. So that's what we have here. It's an apocalyptic book. And so part of it is understanding this is saying one thing, but talking about another. It's sort of like any of you guys watch the TV show MASH? Anyone ever watch MASH? All right. MASH was an apocalyptic kind of story, all right? It was written to help people deal with a war that was not going well. It was difficult. It was tearing our country apart. Vietnam was going on, and so they told a story about war, but it wasn't set in Vietnam. It used a different time. It used Korea to help us think about what we were going through as a country. He used one story to help us understand another. So when the Jewish people who were being persecuted would read stories of Daniel, and Daniel in Babylon and Persia, this was set 100, 200 years before, earlier than the time that they were living in. When they heard talk about the Babylonians, they said, oh, okay, we understand now how to live with these Greek oppressors that we have now. Or sometimes the images would be of the end of times and talking about armies of angels and the forces of light and the forces of evil that were doing battle to one another. They weren't reading this and saying, boy, I wonder when the end of the world's going to come. They were saying, all right, this is our life. We get this. We see the conflict of good and evil, light and dark, happening all around us. And one of the unique things you're going to find in the reading today is that we also hear about the resurrection. Now, we don't usually think about that in the Old Testament before Jesus, all right? But here in the Old Testament, at this time in Judaism, they had experienced enough suffering and injustice in their world. They know that they said, this isn't, it's not working the way it's supposed to. And the Bible says God blesses and rewards the good and punishes the evil. But bad things are happening to good people. Evil people are getting away with murder. So it's not working out the way it's supposed to. And for there to be justice, things have to be made right in an afterlife, right? So we're going to hear then the first glimpse, the first hint we have of God's justice, of there being more to the story than just this life. From the book of Daniel. At that time, Michael, the great prince, protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like stars forever and ever. All right, our gospel reading today. The context is similar to last week. It's the last few days of Jesus' life. So the events that have happened a couple days before this was Jesus coming into what we call Palm Sunday, entering into Jerusalem, everyone cheering for him. First thing he does is go to the temple, throws out the money changers, and everyone gets all upset. The village leaders then begin to plot how they're going to kill Jesus. It's been a busy couple days. So what Jesus is doing now for the next few days, during the day he will gather with the crowds in the courtyards of the temple. At night he'll go and leave the city. But I want for our reading to make sense, I have to tell you a little bit about the temple. Temple is not like church. Sometimes we hear the word temple, church, we figure, it must be the same thing. Not at all. When you went to the temple in Jerusalem, there were no seats. You could not sit down. We didn't gather together and say, let's let's have some worship together. It wasn't a building you went into. It was mainly open courtyards. And one of the big things was this massive big altar that had a fire burning on, and you would bring your goat or your sheep or whatever, your cattle, whatever you were going to offer. You'd give it to the priest. He would take it up. He'd put it on the fire, burn it up, offer that which was valuable up to God, and then you would go and you would find some place to pray with you, your family, wherever you wanted to do that, somewhere in the courtyards. They had special places where men could go, another place for women, another place for non-Jewish people if they wanted to come and to worship. They had different courtyards for each of them. But there was only one temple. It wasn't like every town had a temple. There only was one temple in the whole country. And there was only one site where that could be, and that was Mount Moriah. Right? So, why did they build the temple on Mount Moriah? If you remember last week I was talking about the primary act of worship is coming and offering up something that is valuable to us. Well, there's a story about Abraham, father of our faith, the one who he is tested by God, and God says, I want you to give up that which is most valuable to you. I want you to give me your son. And Abraham is willing to do that. And God says, okay, stop. I needed to know you're willing to do that. I don't want you to give me your son. And here's a sheep caught here, and sacrifice the sheep. The sheep's blood will take the place of your son. And where was this done? This was on Mount Moriah. So when Solomon was saying, I want to build a temple where we can offer that which is value to us and offer it up to God, where will I build this temple? I will build it on Mount Moriah. And that's what he does. And so he has this magnificent temple that King Solomon builds. But they get a little cocky. King Solomon likes to show off. So he says, I'm going to invite all these foreign dignitaries to come and see that everything in the temple is plated with gold. And here's the treasury. And here's all the piles and piles of money we have. And shows that to all his neighbors. Now, and all his neighbors say, plated with gold, lots of treasury. And so when the country falls into civil war, they split into Israel and Judah, and his neighbors say, it's time to pick up the pieces. And the Babylonians come in, the Assyrians come in, and they wipe out Israel, and they're getting ready to come plunder the temple, but the Babylonians attack the Assyrians on their other front, and so they have to pull back, and eventually the Babylonians come and say, no, this is ours. And they come in and they strip everything, all the gold out of the temple. They tear the whole thing down, completely destroy it, and carry everyone off to Babylon. All right, so eventually they come back, and they need to rebuild the temple again, but they don't have the resources. They've been destroyed by civil war. They put up something to worship in, but it's nothing like it once was, until King Herod comes on the scene. We call him Herod the Great. He was actually awful. This is the guy who decided he wanted to kill baby Jesus and didn't know where he was, so he killed all the babies in Bethlehem. He was ruthless. He had 10 wives, dozens of kids. Many of them he killed because he didn't want them taking his throne and stuff like that. He was ruthless. He was terrible. He was powerful. The Romans liked him because he could keep order. He was absolutely crazy. But he also was a gifted architect who had incredible designs for building things. He built this amazing palace for himself. He built a retreat center about 8 miles out of town where he could go to get away from things. He built a seaside resort with a deep water harbor so the ships could come in and bring all the goods that he wanted to have. He built amphitheaters and coliseums and temples to the Roman gods. But his crowning achievement, probably his greatest work, was to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. It was an incredible structure. Everything Herod did was big because he wanted to be remembered. Here we are talking about him. All right, and so he was going to rebuild the temple. So where do you build the temple? Mount Moriah. All right, so there's a little temple there. There's not a lot of space, but there's a temple there. But Herod says that is not big enough for what I want to do. So what does Herod do? He says, I'm going to build some retaining walls, massive, huge retaining walls, and I'm going to take fill dirt. I'm going to fill it all in. So instead of having a little top of a mountain, I've got this huge courtyard that I can use to build a temple, and it's going to look something like this. It stands out in Jerusalem, right? You look at the other buildings around there. It boggles the mind how big this thing was, that Herod is going to say, this is my statement. I'm going to take this little mountaintop and turn it into this. It's going to dwarf any other building. Nothing comes even close. The stones that's going to take to do this, build this retaining wall, are massive. The big ones you can't see the big ones underground. They weighed 500 tons each. I don't know how you move 500 tons. All right, this massive 40-foot long stones that they would put in place. The wall wasn't going to go anywhere. He wanted this to stay, and so he built it 15 feet thick. All right, and so the stones that we see here, the ones that Herod built were about from this level down are the ones that were Herod built. The other ones were added on later. We'll get into that part of the story. But those were small ones. Those were only 25 tons each. All right, so he brings these stones in here to do that. Can you imagine how much manpower it took, how much expense it took to hand chisel out that many stones to build something of that size? And it didn't come out of Herod's pocket, right? He taxed the people. You have to pay for all those masons, for all that wood, all that work to be able to do that. People were paid for that. That came from the people. So Herod was not very popular with the people, but what he created was impressive. Unfortunately, within a generation, it would all be torn down, right? The Romans got tired of the insurgency, and they came down hard. They came to Jerusalem. The walls were impregnable. There's no way they could break down the walls. So they simply surrounded. They let all the pilgrims come in for Passover, and then they closed the doors and said no one is getting out. No one could get in or out for 3 years. No food, no water, dead bodies just piled up everywhere. He said, we are just going to surround the city and we are going to wait them out. It was complete devastation. It was the worst possible thing you can imagine going on until they were so weak they could not defend themselves. They finally then were able to come, destroy Jerusalem. They just tore it down. They burned, they razed the place completely. There was not one stone left upon another. 600 years later, another religion arises. We call it Islam. They came to this pile of rubble, and they rebuilt the walls, took the pieces, they built them back up again to create a place they would have there. And now they have a worship site on that. But there's still remnants of Herod's massive project. You can see little bits and pieces of it. There's a section right in there, which we call the Western Wall. That's what you saw that picture of before. And for Jews, this is their holiest place, because it's not part of the temple. It wasn't a temple wall. It's simply part of the retaining wall. You can see up where the ground level was up above it there. But it was the closest bit of the wall to where the temple once stood. Still is impressive. Let me read from Mark chapter 13. Jesus came out of the temple. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." And Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be torn down." When he was sitting at the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when is this going to be? What's the sign that these things will be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "Beware no one that leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and he will lead them astray. When you hear of wars, rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes. In various places there will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. All right. Disciples are freaking out. They were duly impressed by these large stones that Herod had erected. They represented wealth and power and permanence. They could not imagine that they would not endure forever. The disciples, like many of us, bought into that perception that the bigger is better, right? And those in power will always hold power. But Jesus came to challenge all that. He says, no, there's another way. Herod will come and go. Romans will come and go. That which was state-of-the-art today will someday gather dust in a museum. Things change. And God is doing a powerful new thing. This kingdom of God that I've been talking about is a new day, a different way of thinking about power. It's not something that's imposed. Power is not something imposed on someone else. It's something that is called forth. And in the kingdom of God, we're going to play by different rules. Now, by the time Mark was writing this gospel, Christians were already being persecuted. The Romans had decided that they were going to squash this movement. And so you have passages like that we hear from Mark here about persecution and trouble, and passages like the book of Revelation, or passages that they would come back to, like we heard from Daniel, that help them think about how do we live through difficult times. And so we read these books, but we have to remember they're apocalyptic. They're written in code. They're talking, using stories about one thing to tell us about how we are living right now. So things like the book of Revelation, it's not a countdown to say how the end of the world is going to come. It was never intended to do that. It was talking to people in the first century. How do I live under persecution? There's some people who've tried to take it and take everything literally and say this means this and this means that, and they do that every generation. There's someone who says, I got it all figured out. Let's all stand on a hilltop, wear white robes, because this is the end of the world. Never is, right? Because that's not what it was designed to do. That's not what it tells us. Or there's people like John Darby. 1830 invents something called the rapture, right? There was no rapture before 1830. John Darby wanted to scare people into faith, and so he took a little bit of Daniel, a little bit of Revelation, a little bit of 1 Thessalonians, ignore the context, throw them together, and you get a rapture. Good news is no one's getting left behind, right? It's a fiction. It's a story John Darby made up. The truth is, every generation reads these passages, these stories of tribulation and difficult times, and we resonate because we recognize, yes, life gets crazy sometimes. I mean, you look at the news and you say, what is the world coming to? Every generation has been able to see this is certainly the Antichrist, because no one's ever been as evil as that. No one's ever been evil as Stalin or Hitler or Idi Amin or Saddam Hussein. Or every generation, you can find someone who epitomizes evil for us. We've always had war. We've always had famine. We've always had earthquakes. Every generation can read these stories and say, this is our life. This is what's going on all around us. Life is not the way it's supposed to be. This world is scarred and broken by sin. But the bottom line of the book of Revelation or Daniel or this apocalyptic kind of thing that Mark was talking about here is that we don't have to be afraid. The idea was not to somehow scare people into heaven by telling scary stories. It was to say, as scary as it gets, we know how the story ends. The story ends with God wins. Right? Light is stronger than darkness. Good is stronger than evil. No matter how terrible things look right now, God has not abandoned us. God is going to be with us as we work our way through this. Again, last couple of days, the headlines filled stories of terror. This time it was Paris. Next week it'll probably be somewhere else. We can give in to fear. where we can cling to hope.